Hello, Congressman. How are you?
Hey, Joan. Great. How are you? Is everyone safe and healthy?
So far, we are both safe and healthy. How about you? Because you're being forced to wander the hallways of the Capitol.
Yeah, we've had to go back 3 times now in the last 6 weeks, and it's a little bit of a surreal experience even traveling there at this point. But we're good. We're healthy, and my wife, she's a physician, and part of her duties is intubating COVID patients in the ICU. So we're saying an extra prayer for all of our healthcare workers and frontline workers at this point.
Oh my gosh! Not only is she on the front lines, but she's on the front of the front lines when doing that kind of work. I just a week or so ago, I think it was in the New York Times, they profiled an anesthesiologist and what it was like to do. And he said in an 8-hour shift, he would do 10 to 12 COVID intubations, and how every time he sort of felt like his life was on the line. You must be so worried about her.
Well, fortunately, we're concerned, but fortunately, she is just one of the toughest and most safety-conscious physicians there is. So she has bought her own personal protective equipment to supplement what she's been given at the hospital, and that's a separate conversation because, quite frankly, our president has utterly failed in his duties to supply the American people and their first responders with sufficient personal protective equipment. But that being said, she's well, and we're so thankful for all of our first responders right now.
Amen to that. So tell me about the HEROES Act. I know there's lots of really interesting provisions. Let's start with the stimulus checks.
Yes. So, in my humble opinion, I disagree with Secretary Mnuchin, who thought that, a $1,200 stimulus check might last someone 10 weeks. Well, it turns out it doesn't.
Jeez.
And what this does is it takes recognition, or it basically, helps working families with the extra expenses that they are facing right now. And if you're someone who has lost a job or lost a lot of hours, it helps you to put food on the table and keep a roof over your head. So it's $1,200 per family member, up to $6,000 per household. It's another round of checks, and this time it corrects for what I believe was an error in the first round, which was not allowing adult-dependent children to be eligible for checks. And so this time it allows for that.
You know, it was interesting. I was watching the live stream of the Chicago City Council meeting on Wednesday, and during the public comment section, I thought this was so interesting. There were a number of landlords, not the big, corporate landlords that have, 15 high rises, but more the mom and pop operations with a 4-flat or a 6-flat kind of place. And they were actually saying to the city council, don't give money to big corporations, give money to the people living in our buildings, because if they can't pay their rent, a couple of them said, look, we're going to be in foreclosure. We understand that our tenants are having a tough time, but if they don't pay their rent, we're going to lose the building. And please, can you do anything to try to, instead of giving money to companies, give money to people so that they can pay some of their bills, and then the rest of us who depend on that can stay afloat. And I thought that was so interesting, and such a surprising argument for landlords to be making is exactly what you're saying. Get more money into the hands of the people who can really use it. Now, one thing I was curious about, I know about the $1,200 checks, but the press release I got on this said that it could provide up to $6,000 for families. And how would that work?
It would be up to $6,000 per household. So in other words, what it contemplates is maybe a married couple with 3 kids, let's say. And in that case, it would be 5 times $1,200 or $6,000. But, basically, you're absolutely right about your observation, which is that, when these types of families receive these checks. It's not like they put it into their bank vault and admire the money as it's piling up. They go out and spend it. They spend it on rent. They spend it on food. They spend it on those necessities that allow their family to sustain themselves. And so it has a multiplier effect, as the economists like to say. So it really does benefit the economy in a bigger way than giving it to people who already have money or don't need it, don't need additional.
We need to take a real quick break. When we come back, I know that one of the things that Governor Pritzker and other governors across the country, and Mayor Lori Lightfoot, too, for that matter, they've been saying that because of the devastation that COVID-19 is wreaking on budgets, that states and local governments need help from the feds as well. Yes. And I want to talk to you about that aspect of the HEROES Act when we come back. I'm talking with Congressman Raja Krishnamoorthi from Illinois' 8th District, and we'll be back with much more after this.
Joan Esposito, live, local, and progressive on WCPT 820.
I want to let the audience know we've had a little bit of a technical problem here today, so we are not broadcasting as we usually do on Facebook Live. We're going to get that up and running again for you tomorrow. If you want to hear a replay of this, since it will not be available on Facebook, you can always go to the WCPT SoundCloud page. WCPT 820 is our handle for pretty much all of our social media anytime you want to find it. Right now I'm talking with Congressman Raja Krishnamoorthi, who represents the 8th District in Illinois. And we're talking about the HEROES Act, which is the most recent package that our Congress has put together to try to help people and organizations get through these trying times and get to the other side of this. And one of the big sticking points, seemingly, with the Trump administration has been this idea that state and local governments need help from the federal government during these times. Tell me what funding for state and local governments is in this current HEROES Act.
Well, thank you for bringing that up. I think that this is the key element of this act, because what it does is it helps states, local county governments, as well as municipal governments get the money to basically take care of our heroes in government, whether they're police, firefighters, EMS, whether they're sanitary workers or other public health related people who are necessary for fighting the pandemic. And so it contains at least $500 billion for states, $375 billion for local governments, as well as money for territories and tribes. But I got to tell you, Joan, this is something that it's not just Democrats asking for it, it's Republicans, it's our nonpartisan mayors and village presidents throughout Illinois. And I think that I believe that the White House is going to have to act very soon, because if they don't, there are going to be potentially millions of layoffs across the country, which only deepens the recession.
Yeah, that's for sure. And, you know, I've got to tell you, I've been following politics for virtually all of my adult life. And, you know, you see bills, some bills and legislation you think's better than others. But I've got to tell you, if they don't fund the post office, I am going to be angrier than I think I've ever been. I love the post office. I think most people love the post office. And these comments from the administration that, well, you know, if it goes away, it goes away. That just, I think that that is such a miscalculation on their part. I understand, you know, some people say, well, Donald Trump would like the post office to go away, then nobody can vote by mail. And then, you know, he has a better shot at getting reelected. I don't care about any of that. I think if you mess with the post office, you mess with the heart and soul of this country.
Well, that's right. I think that especially now, Joan, as people are staying at home and can't shop the way that they would, whether it's for groceries or whether it's for medicine, whether it's getting their medicines, they rely on the mail. And you know this, you know, the US Postal Service is the second most trusted institution or popular institution in the government, only after the armed forces. And so I agree with you. I think that this is not only the wrong thing to do, but it's politically very risky on his part.
And the HEROES Act, if I'm not mistaken, would provide, about $25 billion to the post office? And I believe the administrators have said if something doesn't happen, they could run out of money as early as this September. Is that what your understanding is too?
Yes, unfortunately. And the reason is very simple, which is that although some parcel volume has gone up, their first and third class mail, it's those circulars, those flyers that you get from the grocery store or the department stores, those have really dropped in volume because the economy is so bad.
Yeah.
And so they vitally need the revenue. And this is a longer conversation, but even before this pandemic, the Trump administration had been so hostile, as well as previous Republican administrations, that they basically were saddled with burdens, economic burdens that no other part of government, and for that matter, not any corporation in the private sector would be burdened with, such as pre-funding retiree health care for 75 years. As an example.
When I first heard about that, I didn't understand it, but then I watched a cable news show and they explained that. They explained what an onerous burden that was and how that was a requirement of virtually no other agency.
That's exactly right. I in fact, when I first heard about it, I had to do a double take. I'd never heard of such a concept. So this is unfortunately become a politicized issue. But as you mentioned before, I concur. I think the American people stand by the Postal Service and their letter carriers and all the people that work for them.
I can understand why some issues become politicized, but the post office seems so neutral. It seems like something that, would, if there was any organization that could have incredible bipartisan support, it would seem to be the post office. I'm sorry, I really have trouble wrapping my head around people who are anti-post office.
I don't get it either. I spoke to a group of rural letter carriers. I was invited to keynote their convention, and this was in Texas. And I got to tell you, 70-80% of those people were certainly Trump supporters. But these rural letter carriers are folks that everyone relies on in these rural areas, and to tinker with their future and their livelihood is wrong, and it's dangerous politically.
And I've heard, I've heard probably Republicans talk about privatizing the post office for 10 or 15 years. And the problem with that is, if you look at UPS and you look at FedEx, they go where the money is. When you have a mail carrier whose route when there's 5 miles between houses and they still make that route, there's no money in that. That's why the post office, has different budget constraints than an organization. FedEx can just say, oh, heck, we're not going out there. You come to the FedEx center here in the big town and come get your packages, because it'll cost us too much to drive out there. But the post office does that. They supply this same service to everybody. And that's why I think that they're such an amazing organization.
They really are. They have a universal service mission. They have to service every single zip code and area code in the union. And in fact, for FedEx and UPS, it's so unprofitable for them to perform that similar mission that they actually contract with the USPS to deliver to those other areas. And so, basically, the USPS is doing something which the American people have relied on for 250 years, for one same price for a postage stamp. You can send it anywhere, a piece of mail anywhere in the country, and that's what binds our country, Joan. That's what keeps us together.
Talk a little bit about some of the protections for workers that are in this bill.
Sure. Well, first of all, one of the things that a lot of us feel, especially frontline workers, deserve is something called hazard pay. And this particular HEROES Act provides $200 billion to provide that type of pay for essential workers. And you might ask why. Well, there's not only the additional risk that these people face, but in a lot of cases, these folks' hours have been reduced, even at the same time that they have to put themselves potentially in harm's way. And so this helps to, make up for that in some ways. In addition, there are additional protections. We want to make sure that every employer has an infection control plan as well, because we don't want a surge of infections to develop from people coming back to the workplace and so forth.
Mm-hmm. That makes perfect sense. Okay, now the big issue: what will it take to get Mitch McConnell to be more supportive of programs like these?
I think it's going to be a lot of pressure on him and the White House. Look, these folks know that people are hurting. People are hurting big time. For the first time, Joan, our office is getting a lot of calls for food assistance. Okay, these are from families that were working full time right before the pandemic and now don't have enough money to put food on the table. Okay, and they have a number of other needs as well. And this is happening, I got to believe, not only in our congressional district, but across the country. And so they know that they're going to have to provide more aid. But they also know, based on our HEROES Act, that we have certain elements that are going to have to be required in any package going forward. Joan, one of the things that basically is required now to get anything done is you have to have consensus. And that means not only do you need Republican votes, but you need Democratic votes. And so, for instance, state and local aid is going to be an essential item for us in any future package.
Well, I certainly think that Mitch McConnell is, when I look at some of the things that he says and does, unless he just is ready to leave government altogether and just doesn't care, it seems that so much of what he does, while it might advance their cause a little bit in the short term, in the long term, I think the fallout that the Republican Party is going to have to live with after all of this nonsense, I think it is going to hound them at the ballot box for years to come, because people are looking at this and, and seeing a party that just doesn't seem to care, that just doesn't seem to want to help anybody other than big business.
It's one thing to, engage in political rhetoric. It's another thing to talk about people's lived experiences in a way that's not consistent with the way they're living them. These working families aren't loafers. They aren't people who are looking for a handout. They're not people who decided to go on unemployment to collect unemployment insurance. They were laid off. Their businesses were shuttered, and they need help. And so when the president or Mnuchin or whoever or McConnell basically say it's time to take a pause in the federal government's relief efforts, that's something that my constituents, the vast majority, would disagree with strongly. Now's not the time to take a pause. It's the time to put your foot on the pedal and rush relief where it's needed most and keep people alive. We put the economy into a medically induced coma because of the virus, and we got to prevent it from spreading, but you got to keep the patient alive. And then at some point, we got to wake up the patient and get the patient going again. But to keep the patient alive, you got to provide them with enough money to provide for food, and you got to have the lights on, and you got to have a roof over your head. These are not extravagances. These are not luxuries. These are necessities.
Yeah. And, one of the bits of fallout from this pandemic that we're living through is obviously the disruption in the campaign for the presidency, a campaign that's leading up to an election sooner rather than later. And I feel sorry in a way for Joe Biden. I mean, at first it was not that, nobody wanted to hear any kind of campaign speeches. And now that we've settled into this sort of horrific new normal, it seems that it's still awkward. I mean, I think he's been trying to find new and different ways to get his message out. The live streams from his house and the people he's talking to and the endorsements he's gotten. But hopefully, I hope we will be seeing more of him in the days and weeks to come. Do you think people will be open to that?
I think so. I really do. And I think that you're absolutely right that we need to see more of him. I think that the vice president is such a likable person. He's a decent human being that people need to know about his story more, his compelling life story. And I hope that, and I know that they have some really good people on their campaign. I'm sure they're planning this already, but it would be wonderful to, see more of him. And I do think he has the upper hand right now. I think he has to press his advantage. I don't think this is time to play four corners defense, and I don't think that's what they're going to do. I think they're really going to come out and campaign. But as you said, it's a new world, so we have to do it in a way that's, recognizing the pandemic and what we're going through right now. But I think that he's somebody who's the exact right person for the job. We just need to get the message out.
Yeah, I think so, too. On Monday, I interviewed artist and actor, all-around Chicago guy, Tony Fitzpatrick, and he said, Joe Biden is like a grilled cheese sandwich. It's not fancy, but when you're hungry, it gets the job done.
Well, I was on a conference call with him and what's called the Congressional Asian Pacific Caucus, and there aren't many of us. There's like 8 or 9 of us total in the House. And he's an endearing person. So each person, it was announced at the beginning of the call, each person would have 1 minute to say something, and then we'd engage in some kind of dialogue. And then he said, I've never met a member of Congress who could keep their remarks to less than 60 seconds. So why don't we increase that to 2 minutes and let's give people a chance to talk from, the guy who knows all about that. So anyway, he's a decent guy. I like him, and I think he'll make for an excellent president.
I think so, too. Thank you so much for taking time out of what is, I know, a crazy busy schedule to talk with us. I hope you will come back and update us as things progress on Capitol Hill.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. And thank you for everything that you're doing to cover the events of this pandemic. And please stay safe.
Thank you. We do our best. Thank you so much. That's 8th District of Illinois Congressman Raja Krishnamoorthi.